I was the Special Rapporteur until July of 2015, but it's an honor and thank you very much to the organizers, particularly the NCRI Women's Committee, for inviting me. I met some of your members in The Hague last year at a conference on shelters, and they have kept in touch. I also, listening to the speakers before I've spoken, I kept on remembering a saying, for evil to flourish, all it takes is for good people to remain silent. And I think this room has reflected that you're not remaining silent, no matter in which part of the world you work, because it is silence that will continue to perpetuate the evil that we see flourishing, and it feels as if it affects us on every level, at the individual level, at the institutional level, at the structural levels, and we need to be having more of these conversations because it is women's voices, women's representativity, women's bodies that are being used in these efforts to silence women all over the world. I wanted to remind us, thank you. I want to remind us that we do have an international human rights system that is almost 70 years old. It is not a perfect system by any spread of the imagination. I think many of you in the room will ask, so where is the United Nations when it comes to Syria, to Iran, to the DRC, and to many other countries in the world? It is an imperfect system, but it is a system that has set up a normative framework through international human rights law. And I'd like to remind us of some of the provisions that we can use in our struggles as we articulate, whether it's advocacy, whether it's our legal strategies. How do we use these frameworks to articulate the claims of women's human rights? How do we use the language of international human rights law to examine the compliance of governments to the voluntary undertakings they've taken by signing and ratifying international law? And how do we hold our governments accountable to women's human rights standards that are reflected in many, many instruments? So I start off by acknowledging that the system is not perfect. I teach at the University of Cape Town, and the first thing I say to students is, the United Nations is not an independent, autonomous body. The United Nations is a government of governments. And once we understand that, we start thinking about our expectations, what they can do, what they can't do, because if it's a government of governments, political persuasion comes into it, economic reasons comes into actions or lack of actions, and I think once we understand that, then we think about strategically how do we use the tools. So under international human rights law, states have an affirmative obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights, including by fulfilling their responsibility to act with due diligence, so it's a duty of care, to eliminate violence against women. Elimination of violence against women, whether the violence takes place in private spaces or public spaces, at the hands of state actors, non-state actors, the elimination is critical to women's ability to participate as full and equal citizens. Violence against women and girls has been acknowledged as the most pervasive human rights violation that we face today, whether in times of peace, conflict, transitions, displacements, etc. Viewing violence against women through a citizenship lens, this was the subject of a thematic report that I wrote for the General Assembly to push the conceptual understandings of violence against women, its causes and consequences. And my argument is that when you view violence against women through the citizenship lens, you emphasize women's participation and agency. You highlight the importance of women participating as full citizens in their families, their communities, and their countries, and contributing, because it is a valuable contribution that women and girls can make to the development of their countries. And violence acts as a barrier. It precludes the exercise of civil and political rights, social and cultural rights, economic and development rights, and it's a barrier to the exercise of citizenship. If we look at the civil and political rights frameworks from the UN Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Civil and Political Rights Covenant, women's rights to equality, non-discrimination, dignity on the basis whether it's a sex and gender, to liberty and security of the person, the right not to be subjected to torture, to cruel or inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment. These are contained in international human rights instruments. But we know in reality, that's wonderful on paper, the reality is the experience or threat of violence makes many women reluctant to leave their homes, which then deprives them of their right to take part in the political, economic, social, and cultural spheres of their community. This in turn precludes women from exercising their right to vote, to hold public office, to work, to education, to their right to a secure livelihood, to their right to access to justice and to justice itself, and the right to health, among other rights. The right to life is broadly recognized under international law. Despite this, the prevalence of violence against women resulting in death has grown to alarming proportions all over the world. Globally, in one study, it's reflected that up to 38% of murders of women are committed by intimate partners, people that they are in a relationship with or married to. Some other reports suggest that in some countries, between 40 and 70% of all female victims are killed by a former partner or a current partner. We've also heard earlier on about Iran and the 63 extrajudicial executions that have been carried out. During conflict, women are killed as strategic targets for the purpose of terrorizing civilian populations, and we see that in different parts of the world. Women human rights defenders are often the targets of politically motivated killings, whether during protests, conflicts, transitions, etc. Gender-based violence also negatively affects your right to be free from slavery and servitude, whether this occurs through trafficking, as we see, another global phenomena, forced and early marriages, another phenomena that we see. Forced marriages are occurring, whether through coercion, kidnapping in some countries, physical and sexual violence, and it's a means to force women into unwanted and unequal marriages and into a life of servitude. So the right to be free from slavery and servitude is part of international law. The international community has also acknowledged that certain manifestations of violence are a form of torture. Sexual violence, forced sterilization, forced abortions, female genital mutilation are a form of torture. Due process rights, also entrenched in international law, the right to a fair trial, the right to legal representation, the right to justice, the right to access justice. These are part of what are contained in international instruments. The right to free association and expression is contained in numerous human rights instruments, and the right to women's freedom of movement. The fear of violence occurring in the public space includes harassment, sexual assault, and often leads to women avoiding the public space. Linked to this avoidance is the fear of violence in the private sphere, especially if freedom of movement, association, or expression does not have prior sanctioning permission by males in the household. The use of flogging, other forms of corporal punishment, public executions, is usually linked to the control and limitation of freedom of association, expression, movement. The punishment usually has a collective dimension and is public in character so as to serve a social objective, namely influencing the conduct of other women. So you execute publicly, you flog women publicly, it sends a message to all other women in that country to behave, to follow the dress codes, to follow the limitations on their freedom of movement, expression, opinion, etc. The freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, also part of international human rights law. The use of threat or violence which forces women to practice a dominant religion or to convert to a different faith directly undermines women's freedom of conscience and religion. Additionally, women in some communities, in some minority communities, if we see this particularly in the European context, where they are threatened with violence for openly expressing their religious beliefs, including through their manner of dressing. This is also a violation of human rights and your right to the freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. Violation of privacy rights of women, including, we've seen in some countries, through forced virginity testing in Egypt, forced sterilization, etc., is a violation of your right to privacy, your right to reproductive freedom, your right to bodily integrity, and it undermines women's recognition as full and equal citizens. In terms of economic and development rights, sustainable development goals, we see the post-2015 goals, which have come into effect since September of last year, which is the next 15 years agenda to look at the issue of sustainable development for all, including women. But violence impedes and obstructs women's participation in the public and private sphere. It's a barrier and an obstacle to the achievement of the objectives of equality, development, and peace, as we find in the Beijing Platform for Action. Violence also prevents women from realizing their right to work, to enjoy just and favorable conditions of work without discrimination, including safe and healthy working environments, fair and equal remuneration, free choice of profession and employment, freedom from sexual harassment and non-discrimination on the grounds of marriage or maternity. Sexual harassment in the workplace violates the right to work as it creates an unsafe and hostile environment. Domestic violence can also come to work, where the workplace becomes a site of violence and associated behaviors. Partners seeking to coerce and control their female partners or ex-partners may stalk them in and around the workplace and target them at work to increase their control over them and to compromise women's economic independence, which is, again, another controlling element. When women are economically dependent, they're unable to exercise their autonomy and become active agents in the development of their own lives. The right to own property has been recognized by international law. Unfortunately, many states continue to deny women this right through discriminatory laws on inheritance, land tenure, and property ownership. Even when women are legally permitted to hold property, violence is often used as a mechanism to deprive women of their property rights. Violence impedes women's ability to realize the right to take part in social and cultural rights. This includes your right to access, participate in, and contribute to cultural life. The Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights has stated that participation in cultural life entails meaningful decision-making and the freedom of women to create new communities of shared cultural values, meanings, and practices without fear of punitive action, including violence. Violence impedes the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of health, physical and mental health. Unfortunately, numerous manifestations of violence, including domestic violence, gender-related killings of women, sexual violence, female genital mutilation, and other harmful practices, forced and early marriages, trafficking, infanticide, the deliberate neglect of girls, forced sterilization, forced abortions, lack of effective access to safe abortions, and the lack of informed consent and choice over contraceptive methods are a violation to your right to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. The right to education is also impacted by violence, including family violence, and abuse, sexual violence at school, early and forced marriages, human trafficking, harmful traditional practices. Girls who enter into early marriages often leave school to assume the responsibilities of caring for their spouses, their homes, and to raise a family. This limits their economic opportunities and independence, and it places them at a greater risk of violence. The fact that 60 million girls worldwide are assaulted while traveling to and from school prevents many girls from completing their education and them entering into dependency relationship with males either in their family or in the communities. Violence creates the conditions that deny women their right to an adequate standard of living. Violence may prevent women from leaving their home because there are no shelters, there are no other forms of adequate housing, food, other resources that are necessary to realize the right to an adequate standard of living. Progress has been made nationally, regionally, and internationally on addressing violence against women, but there are numerous gaps, not only at the law and policy and implementation level, but also we've seen a sort of backlash against the demands of women's human rights and the addressing of violence against women. So in some ways, I agree with Rita that we are seeing a shift backwards in some countries. The international community explicitly acknowledged that violence against women is a human rights issue in and of itself. Violence against women has many causes and consequences, but let's clearly understand that this is a human rights violation that we're facing, and understanding root causes and consequences is part of our obligation in trying to make it clear. States have the responsibility. I argue in my reports, both to the Human Rights Council in Geneva and the General Assembly in New York, that in my view, states are not being held accountable for failing in their responsibility to promote the rights of women and girls, including through the provision of effective redress measures for human rights violations. The lack of accountability at national, regional, and international levels has resulted in a culture of impunity for crimes against women and girls, and this in turn has led to a normalization of violence against women and girls in many societies. When we look at the prevalence rates of gender-related killings of women and girls, which for me form part of a continuum of violence, this is a strong reflection that states, governments are failing in their obligations to prevent, respond to, and ultimately eliminate violence against women and girls. Thank you very much for your attention.